In every age, fortune has a face. In Florence, it was a prince crowned in velvet. In New York, it wears a smile in the crowd. History remembers moments when power shifts quietly, not with revolt, but with recognition. When the invisible hand that shaped the old order trembles, and another hand rises to claim the wheel. Machiavelli called it Fortuna, the goddess of chance, the river that sweeps away the unprepared. He warned that she favors those who build the channels before the flood. And 5 centuries later, her current runs again, through the avenues of Manhattan, through the screens that shape belief, through the language of identity and reform. When Zohran Mamdani won New York's highest office, the story was told in headlines: history, progress, representation. But beneath those words flowed a deeper current, a reminder that fortune changes hands not by destiny, but by design. It wasn't merely a political victory. It was a demonstration of timing, of understanding how emotion, narrative, and visibility converge into momentum. A modern illustration of Machiavelli's oldest law, that the crowd follows symbols long before it follows policies. Every generation crowns its new prince, not in palaces, but in perception. And when fortune moves, it doesn't ask permission. It simply shifts its weight, from the comfortable to the cunning, from the predictable to the prepared. New York, like Florence, has always been a stage, and this time the script was rewritten, not by those who inherited power, but by one who understood how power truly moves. Because when fortune changes hands, the world changes language. Fortune never dies, she only changes hands. To Machiavelli, fortune was not luck, it was a river. When the waters ran high, they flooded empires. When they ran low, they revealed who had built the channels. And in the modern city, where light never sleeps and ambition never rests, that river still flows through algorithms, elections, and applause. When Zohran Mamdani won New York's mayoral seat, the headlines read historic, progressive, unexpected. But beneath those words, the river of fortune was doing what it has always done, shifting course, eroding the banks of certainty, carving new paths for power to travel. The city did not simply choose a man, it chose a new mirror, a reflection of what people wished to see when they looked at power. Machiavelli would have smiled. He knew that every age replaces its princes not out of rebellion, but fatigue. The public tires of the familiar mask, and fortune, restless as ever, looks for a new vessel. In Florence, it was the Medici. In New York, it was an idea, a reminder that conviction can still conquer cynicism. But conviction alone doesn't carry cities. Timing does. And timing, in Machiavellian language, is nothing less than strategy disguised as fate. The new prince of any era doesn't seize fortune, he seduces it. He waits until the old world has grown tired of itself, until the promises of the previous rulers ring hollow. Then, when the tide turns, he is already standing where the current will flow. Mamdani's victory wasn't born in the ballot box. It was forged in narrative, the quiet months when a story of renewal began to sound more credible than the story of control. That is how fortune changes hands, not by overthrow, but by replacement of belief. Machiavelli taught that virtù, the disciplined strength of mind, allows one to shape fortune rather than curse it. In Florence, that meant armies and alliances. In New York, it means message, visibility, and timing. The true art of modern politics is not force, it's fluency, the ability to speak to the city in the language it already thinks in: image, rhythm, identity, story. Every campaign is a translation, and those who translate best inherit the world. But fortune is cruelly temporary. She does not belong to those who win once. She belongs to those who adapt when the wind changes. For even as Mamdani's victory electrified New York, the machinery of perception began its quiet work, defining him, interpreting him, turning symbol into story and story into expectation. That is the hidden cost of fortune. Once she gives you her hand, she watches how you dance. The river never truly stops. It only slows before the next flood. Machiavelli warned princes to build walls of prudence against it, to anticipate shifts before they arrive. And in our world, those walls are no longer made of stone, but of systems, communications, narratives, networks of loyalty invisible to the naked eye. The new prince must guard his perception as carefully as the old prince guarded his palace, because power today is not stolen, it is maintained. The moment one stops feeding it with relevance, it finds another hand to hold. Yet fortune also has memory. She favors those who respect her unpredictability. In that sense, Mamdani's ascent in the heart of a global city echoes Machiavelli's deepest observation, that change itself is the most permanent form of power. Florence was a republic built on art and intrigue. New York is its reincarnation in glass and light. Both worship influence as the highest art. Both reward the few who can turn vision into momentum. When fortune changes hands, it is never just about who leads, but about what kind of intelligence now defines leadership. Once it was brute force, then moral rhetoric. Now it is perception, the choreography of sincerity. The river flows not toward strength, but toward relevance. And relevance belongs to those who understand timing better than truth. That's the paradox Machiavelli foresaw, and Mamdani's victory symbolizes. That power is never moral, but it can be meaningful if it understands its moment. And as New York celebrates a new age of promise, somewhere in the shadows of Florence's ruins, the ghost of Machiavelli smiles again. Because once more, fortune has changed hands. And the world, as always, applauds the winner, never realizing that it is fortune herself who keeps score. Power, in every century, hides behind architecture. Once it was marble palaces and cathedral spires. Now, it's glass towers and glowing screens. But the design remains the same. It exists to be admired, not questioned. Machiavelli understood that power is not just what is held, but what is seen. And more importantly, what is believed. The art of ruling, he said, was not to be loved or feared, but to be understood as inevitable, to appear as the natural outcome of history itself. That is the secret of the modern prince. He does not present himself as a ruler, he appears as a result. He makes the people believe they chose him, when in truth, he designed the conditions of their choice. Zohran Mamdani's rise in New York didn't just happen. It was architected. It followed the laws of visibility that Machiavelli hinted at, long before the age of cameras. Control the frame and you control the perception. To control perception, one must first understand desire. The people do not want to be ruled. They want to be represented. They want to see their reflection, noble and victorious, standing at the podium. The new prince gives them that reflection, carefully, deliberately, without excess. He knows that authenticity is the currency of modern rule. But he also knows that authenticity itself can be engineered. It is not lies that win hearts. It is coherence, a story that fits the age's emotions better than reality does. This is the new architecture of power, narrative built from precision. Every appearance, every silence, every gesture becomes a column in a temple of perception. Each word chosen not for what it means, but for how it will echo. The strategist builds structure from invisibles, emotion, symbolism, rhythm. He knows that people no longer obey authority, they follow consistency. And when that consistency becomes rhythm, it becomes law. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately. In The Prince, he wrote that a ruler must appear merciful, faithful, humane, and religious. Not necessarily be so, but appear so. He was describing not hypocrisy, but geometry, the architecture of trust. In New York, this geometry manifests through light and language, campaigns, social movements, the theater of modern progress. The lines are drawn in media headlines. The pillars are built in digital spaces, and the dome is belief itself. The modern prince doesn't control the city. He controls its mood. He shapes its imagination of itself. When Mamdani stood before his supporters, his words carried more than policy. They carried rhythm, the tone of a new chapter being written. Machiavelli would call it virtù, the mastery of necessity, the ability to act in harmony with the times, not against them. For fortune may favor the bold, but she never forgives the tone-deaf. To build power in this century is to design resonance, to sense when the world is ready to believe in a new story, and to stand ready to tell it first. That is what the old philosophers meant by grasping fortune by the hair. She passes swiftly, and only the prepared can catch her. But once power is caught, the architecture must hold, because every story collapses under the weight of repetition. The modern prince must renew belief constantly, with new symbols, new rituals, new expressions of care. He doesn't speak often. He speaks when silence begins to lose its gravity. Each word becomes architecture again, each pause a doorway left open for meaning. Machiavelli warned that rulers who rely on virtue alone would fail, for virtue is fragile against circumstance. Instead, he proposed reasoned adaptability, a ruler who can be lion and fox, bold when needed, cunning when cornered. That duality lives again in modern leadership, to speak to the people's hearts, but to build from their expectations, to appear emotional, but act mathematical, to promise revolution, but deliver rhythm. That is the geometry of perception, invisible lines that guide a crowd's emotion toward one inevitable conclusion: trust. And trust, once achieved, must be managed like gold. It cannot be spent recklessly. It must be reinvested, multiplied, and hidden in symbols that feel human. That's why the new prince wears empathy like armor. He knows that power in the 21st century must look compassionate to survive, because cruelty, once seen, cannot be unseen. But control wrapped in empathy, that lasts forever. The city believes it is freer than ever, but freedom today is not the absence of control. It is the elegance of control so refined that it feels like choice. Machiavelli would call this perfection, the system so complete that it governs through sentiment, and its rulers are loved for their restraint. The architecture stands, unseen yet unbreakable, anchored not in laws, but in the psychology of perception. Every image, every statement, every public gesture becomes a stone in its foundation. And as long as the people believe the structure serves them, they will defend it, never realizing they are defending the walls that shape their own obedience. The modern prince doesn't rule New York from an office. He rules it through narrative design. And that is how fortune becomes structure, how chaos becomes order, how democracy becomes choreography. Machiavelli would not be surprised. He would only whisper, "The architecture has changed, but the blueprint is still mine." Power doesn't exist because people are forced to obey. It exists because people want to. Machiavelli knew this. He wrote that the crowd is a beast of memory, loyal when fed, dangerous when starved. And every ruler, he said, must understand its nature, not to punish it, but to feed it properly. 5 centuries later, nothing has changed except the language of loyalty. The crowd no longer kneels, it applauds. It no longer worships kings, it follows personalities. Its temples are no longer churches, they are screens, feeds, and platforms of belonging. The modern citizen does not crave dictatorship. He craves direction. He wants to feel his values reflected in the power that represents him. The illusion of autonomy, wrapped in the comfort of coherence. When Zohran Mamdani took the stage after his victory, the applause wasn't for a man. It was for a story, a reflection of themselves returned in brighter light. For the first time, the people saw their ideals not begging for inclusion, but winning. It was less about politics and more about emotion, a collective exhale that said, "We belong." Machiavelli would have understood this perfectly. He saw how even republics require myth, how the crowd must always believe in something larger than itself, even when that something is another human being. He would have said, the prince is not a tyrant, he is a mirror, and every generation builds the prince it deserves out of its fears, its dreams, and its fatigue. The psychology of fortune is not about fate, it's about emotional gravity, the invisible pull that binds people to power when logic should repel them. In Florence, that gravity came from religion. In New York, it comes from identity. People no longer pray for salvation, they vote for it. They don't seek heaven after death, they seek validation in history. And so, the new prince gives them meaning. He doesn't control through law, he controls through empathy. He speaks the people's language, mirrors their frustrations, and then transforms those frustrations into movement. This is not manipulation, it is design. Because power without emotion cannot last. The human mind resists authority, but it surrenders willingly to recognition. That's why perception is more important than principle. The crowd does not remember policies, it remembers feelings. How a leader made them feel hopeful, how a moment felt like history, how change felt visible. Fortune rewards those who understand that emotions move faster than reason, and whoever can capture emotion first wins. This is not cynicism, it's realism. Machiavelli wrote not to destroy virtue, but to explain how it could survive in a world built on contradiction. He would have admired how the modern prince uses empathy as his fortress, appearing vulnerable, yet never unguarded. Because empathy, when performed well, becomes invincibility. It draws the people close enough to protect power with their own faith. And faith is the most efficient security system in history. The new prince doesn't tell the people what to think. He tells them what they already believe, but with elegance, confidence, and design. He allows them to see themselves not as followers, but as participants in destiny. That's the genius of modern control. It makes obedience feel like authorship, and it works because the masses crave meaning more than autonomy. Freedom without story feels empty. The mind rebels against chaos, even when it calls that chaos freedom. So it builds symbols to contain the unknown, and power rushes in to fill the void. When Machiavelli observed Florence, he saw this clearly. The people demanded liberty, but feared disorder. They cried for virtue, but adored spectacle. And he knew, whoever could promise both would rule them forever. In New York, the same pattern repeats. Mamdani's victory wasn't only political, it was psychological. It reminded people that power can look different and still feel safe. That rebellion can wear a suit. That revolution can smile, because people don't want chaos, they want control they can love. And love, in politics, is the most strategic illusion ever built. Fortune smiles on those who understand that power is an exchange. The people give devotion, the leader gives direction, and as long as that exchange feels balanced, both sides believe they are free. But beneath that harmony lies the ancient Machiavellian truth. It is not the ruler who depends on the people. It is the people who depend on the ruler's reflection. They need him to define what they are not, to separate the order from the noise, to hold the burden of clarity in a world addicted to confusion. That's why even in an age of democracy, princes still rise. Not because we are weak, but because power offers a language we cannot stop speaking. It gives chaos a shape, fear a name, and history a direction. The psychology of fortune, then, is simple. We do not follow leaders because they are powerful. They are powerful because we need someone to follow. And so the circle continues, from Florence's palaces to New York's stages, from Machiavelli's pen to Mamdani's podium, from the dream of equality to the reality of orchestration. Faces change, the architecture changes, but the human heart remains loyal to its oldest illusion, that power shared is power controlled. Yet Machiavelli would whisper again, the people think they choose, but it is fortune who always decides. Every empire begins with noise, cheers, protests, applause, promises. But the moment victory arrives, the real work begins in silence. Machiavelli understood that the hardest part of power is not winning it, but keeping it unbroken under the weight of expectation. He warned, "The prince must learn how not to be good and use that knowledge when necessary." He meant, control is not cruelty, it is clarity. To govern the world, one must first govern the self. The new prince in New York understands this. His throne is not a chair in City Hall, it's the stillness inside his mind. He has learned that authority today is not measured in laws passed, but in narratives maintained. Every day, he wakes into a world that demands a new version of him. Compassionate but firm, visionary but grounded, confident but never arrogant. The paradox is exhausting. And yet, he cannot show exhaustion, because fatigue is the first crack in perception. So he practices the discipline of invisibility. He speaks when silence would cost him power, and is silent when words would only feed opposition. He listens more than he answers, not from humility, but from calculation. He knows that those who speak to fill space lose the right to define it. Machiavelli would call this prudenza, the mastery of timing, the discipline to act or not according to necessity, not emotion. The modern prince must resist the seduction of his own reflection. The moment he believes the myth built around him, he becomes its prisoner. So he maintains distance, smiling but never too closely, visible yet never completely known. Power today is surveillance disguised as attention. Every gesture is documented, every pause interpreted. The prince walks through light like a man surrounded by mirrors, each reflection waiting to betray him. That is why silence becomes his fortress. In an age of overexposure, mystery is the only privacy left. And mystery, when managed correctly, becomes authority. The crowd calls it authenticity, but authenticity itself has become performance. The modern prince must simulate transparency while guarding his interior world like treasure. He must appear open while thinking several layers beneath his words. It's not deception, it's survival. Because sincerity, unfiltered, is ammunition in the wrong hands. Machiavelli advised his prince to study both the lion and the fox, strength and cunning, courage and concealment. The New York prince embodies both. He moves slowly, speaks gently, but plans like a predator. He knows when to retreat, when to let chaos spend its energy, when to emerge as the calm that follows the storm. He practices emotional minimalism, never giving the crowd more than what the moment demands. He smiles just enough to humanize, pauses just enough to seem thoughtful, responds just enough to remain present. This is not emptiness, it's economy. In politics as in finance, the wise conserve what others waste. He saves his outrage for silence, his fear for solitude, his true beliefs for rooms that don't record. Inside those rooms, he is neither saint nor cynic. He is an engineer of systems, of incentives, of narratives. He understands that governing is not moral theatre. It's maintenance, the quiet balancing of chaos and expectation. Power that endures is built like architecture, every beam measured, every flaw anticipated. The ruler who improvises with emotion invites collapse. So he learns to absorb insult without reaction, to accept misunderstanding without correction, to let others believe they've won small victories, while keeping the larger structure untouched. That is the discipline Machiavelli taught. To bend without breaking, to yield without surrendering, to seem vulnerable while remaining invulnerable. The modern prince wears a suit instead of armor, but the weight is the same. He must protect his image as carefully as a knight guarded his chest plate. A single crack, a scandal, a contradiction, and the illusion of inevitability shatters. So he polishes daily, not his reputation, but his restraint. He resists the urge to respond to every provocation, because reaction is confession. He lets others shout while he becomes the silence they orbit around. The crowd mistakes stillness for wisdom, and in their mistake lies his mastery. Silence is not absence. It is control distributed over time. By waiting, he forces others to reveal themselves, their fears, their impatience, their limits. He doesn't conquer opponents, he outlasts them, because power, stripped of patience, becomes desperation, and desperation is loud. In a world addicted to noise, discipline becomes divine. Machiavelli wrote that fortune is a woman, and she yields to those who are bold. But he forgot to add, she stays with those who are patient. The modern prince knows this. He lets fortune come and go without chasing her. He builds systems instead of moments, silence instead of speeches, and in doing so, becomes unmovable. Power doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who can bear silence the longest. So when the city screams and the cameras follow, he stays still. And that stillness, mistaken for humility, is the heartbeat of his empire. Because the disciplined man does not need to shout to rule. He only needs to wait until the noise exhausts itself. Then, when the world falls quiet again, his voice returns. Calm, measured, inevitable. And once more, the people listen, thinking they chose him, never realizing that silence chose for them. In Florence, the streets once echoed with the march of soldiers and the sermons of preachers. In New York, they hum with sirens and screens. Different centuries, same rhythm, different crowns, same theater. Because fortune never dies, she only changes her stage. When Zoran Mamdani won the mayoralty, many called it history. But history is not just a record of what happens. It's the story of how power learns to reinvent itself. What Florence was to Machiavelli, New York is to us. A mirror of civilization's eternal truth. That power is the art of adaptation. The modern prince walks the same invisible corridors as his Renaissance ancestors. Only the instruments have changed. Where they had swords and parchment, he has data and design. Where they ruled through fear, he rules through fascination. But both understand the same secret, that leadership is not authority, it's theater executed with precision. Machiavelli's ghost would wander through New York with quiet fascination. He would see billboards where banners once hung, algorithms where armies once stood, and realize that manipulation has become mathematics. He would smile, not from approval, but from recognition. Ah, he would say, you have not outgrown me, you have perfected me. Because what he taught in ink, the modern world now performs in light. The same principles of Virtù and Fortuna now govern campaigns, headlines, and ideologies. Power still belongs to those who see before others see, who prepare while others celebrate, who act when others are still thinking. Machiavelli wrote for princes who feared losing their cities. But today, the fear is subtler, the loss of narrative. The modern prince must guard not his castle, but his context. He must make sure the story always bends toward his presence. In an age that forgets everything instantly, remembrance itself is dominance. Mamdani's victory represented more than a political moment. It was proof that even in the most democratic structures, the mechanics of perception remain absolute. The ability to turn visibility into momentum, empathy into command, narrative into infrastructure. That is the virtue of the modern age. He, like the princes of old, inherited not fortune's favor, but her test. Because fortune is never loyal, she moves toward those who can handle her volatility. And New York, a city of ambition, chaos, and contradiction, is her most demanding court. It tests its leaders as Florence once did. Every success becomes a burden, every promise a measurement. And yet, as Machiavelli said, he who builds on the people builds on mud, but the mud, when shaped, becomes foundation. That is what the modern prince does. He shapes the chaos beneath him into coherence. He builds bridges across identity, language, and class, not to erase difference, but to organize it. He turns emotion into motion. He makes the collective dream look structured enough to believe in. That is not deceit, it is art. The oldest art humanity knows, the design of meaning. Machiavelli's ghost would see it and whisper, "You've learned well. You've learned to rule not with fear, but with narrative." He would see in New York what he once saw in Florence, a people proud of their liberty, unaware of how deeply their freedom depends on structure. He would understand that control now wears the mask of choice, that the new princes rule not by decree, but by designing the context in which choices are made. This is the evolution of governance, not the disappearance of control, but its refinement. And yet, Machiavelli's ghost would not condemn it. He would admire the beauty of its efficiency. He would marvel at how rulers no longer need armies to enforce loyalty, only algorithms that know who we are before we do. The Renaissance prince studied geography to expand his realm. The modern prince studies psychology to expand his reach. Both are cartographers of the human condition. Both understand that to rule a people, one must first rule their perception of reality. But fortune is fickle, and even the most refined systems decay. The river will flood again, the story will shift, and another will rise. Someone watching, quietly from the margins, reading the rhythm of change, waiting for fortune's next turn. Because fortune, Machiavelli said, is a woman who must be mastered by boldness. But in the modern age, she is mastered by awareness. The bold have become the thoughtful. The princes have become interpreters. And Machiavelli's ghost, wandering through Times Square's golden light, would finally understand that his philosophy survived not in kings, but in code, in media, in minds trained to read between symbols. He would stop beneath the neon skyline and whisper to himself, "The prince is eternal," because power, like art, is never destroyed. It is only inherited by those who dare to see clearly. And then, quietly, he would fade into the noise of the city, smiling as he disappears. Because once again, fortune has changed hands, and the new rulers of the world still call themselves servants. Power never disappears. It only learns new languages. It speaks now through systems, screens, and smiling faces. It hides inside empathy, dresses itself as equality, and rules not from thrones, but through design. You've seen how fortune moves, how she shifts her favor, not through justice, but through readiness. How every age builds its own prince, and every people fall in love with the story that defines them. From Florence to New York, from Machiavelli's pen to the city's streets, the pattern never changes. Only the costumes do. The question isn't who rules, it's who understands the rules. Because in every age, the powerful are not those who fight hardest, but those who see earliest. Those who can stand still as the crowd moves and sense the rhythm of history before it plays its tune. Maybe that's why fortune rewards clarity, because awareness is not rebellion, it's immunity. If you've listened this far, you already feel it. That quiet shift inside your mind, the part that now watches the world instead of obeying it. So stay, keep thinking, keep watching. Because this isn't a channel, it's an awakening disguised as cinema. Subscribe, not for content, but for consciousness, for the silent rebellion against illusion, because fortune will change hands again. And when she does, you will be ready.